Afternoon to you.
Hello,
nice to have you
Michael.
on. How are you? Did you read that judgment this morning in your local paper?
Yeah, I did, and it was. I thought the tikanga thing was sort of stretching it a wee bit. I mean, I don't know what it is, but it'll be interesting to see where that goes.
It certainly will.
Just on top of that, I've been watching the Worldometer, how we're going, and we've been running regularly on 10% more deaths per million of population in Australia. And I think that's interesting because the argument has been that we've been saving lives. Dame Jacinda saved all these lives compared with other places. Living in an island helped, but
absolutely.
The idea that no one has been saying we're actually 10% more people dying than Australia, actually. So just to put a bit of reality around that, I thought.
Oh, that's interesting because the vaccination rates are roughly the same, Australia and New Zealand, same vaccines too. So what would that suggest, though, that our general health wasn't as good as the Aussies or that they had a better public health system than us?
Oh, I would think that. And I would think that some of the measures we took didn't make a blind bit of difference.
Yeah. No, that's what we've been talking about this morning as well.
Yeah.
Now, what do you want to talk about this week? What have been your key political issues?
I thought, a couple of things. The first is the Mayor of Auckland, or not necessarily the first, and the second is Oranga Tamariki, in whichever order. What do you...
Well, let's start with the Mayor of Auckland. A fascinating chap, Wayne Brown.
Yeah.
He's in his mid-70s.
No, Wellington.
Tory Whanau. Oh, well, completely opposite end of the spectrum. Half his age, different ethnicity, different politics, completely at the other end of the spectrum. Probably enjoyed alcohol as much as, well, to be perfectly honest with Wayne Brown.
Yes.
Possibly more.
I think it's interesting what she's been pinged for, as it were, because leaving a restaurant without paying is something that's, can happen.
Yep.
And if you are, as she even now describes herself as tipsy or merry, even more likely that you just weren't sort of completely on top of the ball when you left. On
top of the paying game.
Yeah. Interesting, though, that she hasn't been pinged for going out with Let's Get Wellington Moving people and celebrating a political, in her case, she thought a political win, but in their case, this is their livelihoods. And so she's going out drinking with the people who
are going. Well, she's going to the establishments of the people who are most affected by her decision.
Oh no, the group who went out before, just one person later. She was out celebrating.
Oh, so she'd been out twice. So she's on a second celebration, was she, when all these incidents?
That's right. She went out with a group with Let's Get Wellington Moving, which has got to be a not terribly smart thing to do, I'd have thought, in a conflicted sort of sense. It just smells of, no wonder they're celebrating with her, because it's their jobs that are at stake and things. But the person who she was out with, I gather from the news, was a major contractor with Let's Get Wellington Moving, and that's the person who we understand went back and paid the next day. Now, somewhere in the middle of that, it doesn't feel good to me. So,
well, that would be quite significant. Sorry, so let me get this right. I'm not across this. I am aware of the issue, but you're saying that the person that she had the meal with at the restaurant, and for which these interchanges occurred that have been reported upon, was somebody who stood to financially gain from the decision of the Wellington City Council to continue with their particular policies.
I gather from the news that, yes, it was and that she said it was, or somebody did, and I would stand corrected if that's not the case, but I understand from what's come out in maybe Stuff or somewhere that it was somebody who had a contracted arrangement with Let's Get Wellington Moving.
Well, that would be that would be a very unfortunate association.
It would be, and especially
it's funny you should say that, because that's one question I would have been asking if I'd been the mainstream media, because the mainstream media have only gone half the way on this issue. And if I was stuffed, the question I'd be saying is, you're absolutely right, who were you dining with and who paid the bill? Those are legitimate questions, particularly the latter, given the sensitivity of the vote and the large number of people who stood to gain or financially lose from the decision of the Wellington City Council last week. It's a very legitimate question.
And I'd be interested in how they collected together to celebrate too, the bigger group of them. Who that was, who paid for what there.
Well, you could probably
that went.
You could probably get that under the official. I was just going to say, could you get that under the Official Information Act? Perhaps not.
Yes, if it's between. See, the people involved with it, Let's Get Wellington Moving, is an unholy trilogy in its own way.
Yes, it is.
Council and regional council and the government, and so there's staff members from all those three, and there's contractors from all those three, and there's the staff of Let's Get Wellington Moving. Who was at those drinks? Who celebrated with her? On what circumstances? How did they organise that?
And who paid for them? Did they use the Wellington City Council, Regional Council, Let's Get Move Wellington credit card to pay for those things? Yes, it's a fair point you raise.
And I'm guessing not.
Well, I don't know.
No, we don't. But if that was a related person who was out with her at the later part of the time, the whole thing wasn't wise, you'd have to say.
Okay, is it sackable, though? I mean, she's been publicly embarrassed over it. She'll be up as a meme or a meme, I'm sure, if she isn't already, in social media. She came across to me as quite an arrogant woman in her responses, like, I've done nothing wrong, stuff you, which will cause damage or not of its own. 3-year term mayoralties in Wellington are quite common, so, she could be thrown out quite easily next election, having suffered some political damage now. That's it, isn't it, really?
Well, it depends what the answers to the questions of what involvement was it with the people. But there's an Official Information Act.
You're a very good user of the Local Government Official Information Act and Meetings Act. There's a good question that you could pose to them, Hilary.
Yes. We can presume that it wasn't...
In fact, as I recall, and I'm just informing our listeners, that this person that I'm talking to managed to successfully use a Local Government Official Information Act to, in actual fact, get rid of the chairman, the elected chairman, of a local government organisation through what you found through that Act request. So you have a bit of history.
Yeah, I think you'll find, Michael, that it was a vote of the regional council, a majority of the members.
Yes, that's right. But they had information provided them by a certain councillor, Hilary Calvert, as I remember.
Well, it's only because
who had used the Local Government Official Information Act to find that information. So, I'm just saying.
Look, if people, what I particularly don't like, and I've never liked, is the idea that people are supporting each other in ways we don't understand, and anything that borders on any corrupt or interested party or something. I just don't like that at all.
No, fair enough.
It's not my thing.
So the lack of transparency
it's not New Zealand's thing.
Well, it's become more so, hasn't it? I mean...
And I'm fighting it. I don't like it.
No, and rightly so, because, mind you, there's so many principles now. You might argue that she was simply following tikanga values. Who knows?
Well, I'd like to know what those values are.
Wouldn't we all?
It's interesting, like Meng Fong, who seemed to think that
yes, good
what
example.
he was doing, and not only was he receiving money from somewhere in the middle of that stuff, but his response when challenged on it was, they threw me under the bus.
He actually didn't think he'd done anything wrong.
No. And I think tikanga, from what I've seen on the edges of it, and I really don't know, and I'm not allowed to probably have any sort of appropriate comment because who am I to tell other people what their customs are? But generally tribal systems work in a way such as that the senior members of the tribe have got rights to do what they want to do and talk to who they want and benefit themselves and their own aunties and cousins and things. So if you follow the usual tikanga of a tribal system, you would find that the idea of people being compensated for a variety of things that the rest of us might think of as conflicts of interest and things is quite acceptable and in fact expected. Couldn't comment on whether that's happening in New Zealand.
No.
Just looks like the sort of thing a tribal system would throw up.
Having said that, we certainly need to know what tikanga values are. I tell you what it reminds me of, because somebody's also reminded us earlier today in our conversation of the Ellis case. Tikanga values being used in the Ellis case to posthumously exonerate Peter Ellis from the Christchurch civic crash convictions. But it reminds me of the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, which was put into legislation in New Zealand and which nobody bothered to actually define what those principles are, and we left it to the courts to do so. Again, we look like we have activist courts, whether it's the Court of Appeal, the Supreme Court, or whether or not it's, in this particular case, the Chief Employment Judge, who are interpreting these things themselves, independent of Parliament. Does that worry you?
Yeah, it does, and it's worse in some respects because it's not completely independent of Parliament. Parliament's all over the place, which is bringing us to with right to everything. It's got undefined Maori. When you're talking English, Maori words dropped into English, so it's not speaking Maori. It's when you're speaking English, dropping words into it. Right through everything. And that gets me to the Oranga Tamariki problems we're having at the moment. And they start at the top, for example, in saying there's something called Voice, VOYCE, Whakaronga Mai, which is the advocacy service for children in care, run by Oranga Tamariki. And apparently VOYCE, so here's a combination of a non-word in English and two Maori words, and this is in an English description, and it is apparently VOYCE is Voice of Young and Care Experienced. So the whole thing is complete bullshit when you start it, really, and then you realise that Oranga Tamariki has been struggling for years, and it didn't seem to help it when it was rebranded as Oranga Tamariki. But what they're trying to do is, and they've done it again in 2018 and then again in September 21, Maori and community collectives must be strengthened, restored and empowered to lead prevention of harm for children, rangatahi and their whānau. The purpose must be clarified, mana of the core social work function rebuilt and properly supported, and off it goes. Nothing happens. Absolutely nothing. If anything, more people put their hands up and say, this system has caused me pain, mischief, harm, whatever. And so all this money is being spent creating boards and principles and
values,
recommendations for change and values. And I mean, so based under the report, Hippo Kingiai ki te kahu aroha Hippo Kingiai ki te katoa, absolutely nowhere, gone backwards. What's the point of that? And if you're talking about the voice, however you might spell it, and combine that with the by Maori, for Maori movement that's out there at the moment, I'd be interested in listening to the people at the bottom of the bucket here that we're not dealing with will, the children and teenagers and things in the middle of their, particularly Maori ones, and say, would you like us to spend money on trying to help you out of being at the bottom there, or would you like us to put more Maori words in our next report?
Well, yes.
Because that's what we're just writing more and more reports.
And having no practical effect.
Absolutely no different.
Yeah. I'll tell you what,
so
we have done this before.
Maori, we should be.
I'm thinking of a precedent for this. Do you remember Maori mental health? In the 1980s, there was a view that only Maori could look after Maori because only Maori understood Maori when it came to mental health issues. Do you remember that? And
yeah, vaguely.
And do you remember Titawhai Harawira was part of that? You know? And she and the Harawiras and the Health Yards took over, was it Oakley in Auckland, a mental health institution,
Oh, right.
on the basis that Maori people ministering the mental health to Maori people, and they were given a contract to do so, was always going to be a much better outcome than Europeans doing it through the mental health process. So it was sort of Maori for Maori. And we all know how that turned out. Titawhai Harawira and her family, I think it was it Oakley in Auckland, became bywords for systematic abuse and for unprofessional care. And in fact, they closed it down because of the repeated allegations of violence that emanated from that facility. So it's not that we haven't used Maori for Maori before. In the late 1980s, Hilary, there was also a move called devolution. Do you remember that? Devolution?
Oh, yes. Yes.
Which was, again, devolving from government departments the care, so whether it was a Maori job training, which was a disaster, it was called Maori Access. Mana, the idea of giving job creation, not job creation, enterprise creation schemes and things like that. And the idea that Maori will be able to do things better for Maori than the current state system. That was the thinking. So we've tried it before. It was a disaster. We seem to be doing that now across the range, not just in economic issues, but also, as you point out, in social and childcare issues as well. Is there any proof that the system is delivering a better result?
No, and it's also in the same sentence. It's getting worse, I think. In the same sentence, people are arguing against that same principle. So we have people now talking about the health system, and we say on the one hand, we should have a separate
Maori Health Authority.
A lot of people delivering Maori Health Authority and things. Yeah. And on the other hand, we've got people arguing against the postcode lottery, so-called, because we want equity in delivery of health services.
Yes. Yeah,
in the same breath.
Yeah.
I mean,
you're absolutely right.
And are they not seeing that that's the opposite of each other?
Yeah.
I mean, and the equity in health provision is what we'll all be striving for, in the sense of why do they take our taxpayers' money from to deliver things equally to everybody throughout New Zealand where you can. So why would you... It beggars belief, and holding those two concepts in the same head seems silly. And these are quite smart people, some of them, who manage to argue for both those things at once. Or at least they don't argue for them, do they? Because what they're doing is saying that it's important that these two things are happening. There are no arguments saying why it will provide better outcomes or any evidence of it. And you've just pointed to a few things to say there's evidence that it doesn't. And I'm saying, why don't you ask the people at the bottom of the heap, not ask appointed iwi representatives or people who are going to make money out of this. Ask the people at the bottom, do you think me using more Maori words on national radio is going to help you at the bottom, or what do you think?
Yeah. No, it's a fair point. It's a very fair point. And I guess that then raises issues of, when you talk about equity, it's still, the story that really intrigued me last week was the story of Sir James Wallace. Well, he soon won't be Sir James Wallace. He'll be common James Wallace, sexual abuser and molester. But how it's still, what struck me from that was not anything to do with the acidity, but still the ability of money to make the system jump in this country. And we've still got a two-tier justice system where a man can be in prison. Was he in prison for 2 years, or he's been in there for about a year already? And he still has name suppression despite being found guilty of sexually abusing 3 men and seeking to pervert the course of justice. I mean, it's extraordinary that money still has such enormous value in the justice system. No wonder young Maori who steal, a keg of beer from your local liquor land get a bit upset.
What's making it worse at the moment, and it is getting worse, is that justice delayed is justice denied.
Absolutely.
And so if you've got enough money, you can long finger things.
Yeah.
And the system is long fingering everything at the moment anyway.
Yeah.
It's long fingering. It's 18 months before somebody goes to trial when they only needed 3 months to prepare for something. So the system is taking forever. Even sentencing is taking months.
Yep.
When they should be just able to go away and spend their Fridays writing sentencing, whatever. So we're not the system delaying things. Didn't somebody say that 50% of the people in prison at the moment are on remand?
On remand. I mean, that's just appalling. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And it's also appalling that they're being locked up for maybe 3 hours a day or whatever. If these are people who we haven't even
convicted, yeah, right,
convicted,
yeah,
and we're turning them into worse people, and it's our fault. We should take responsibility for keeping people in that environment for those lengths of time, and that's a really mean thing to do. How would we manage
is it the justice system? Is it the justice system in this? I mean, the justice system's is ground to a halt in New Zealand at the moment. You're absolutely right. You're talking criminal. Try civil cases as well, which are even longer in duration before they are heard in this country. Whose fault is that? They're all blaming COVID, and they got stupid over COVID. They really did, Hilary. The number of court...
Nothing to do with COVID. That's bullshit.
Yeah, but they blame COVID. But they would call off trials that they could have done. And they also had a problem embracing new technology. Do you remember at the time? So instead of having court cases by Zoom or something like that, we could have just let the whole thing go on anyhow. No, we can't possibly do that. They had to be cancelled for months on end. So they've created the problem for themselves. But again, you come back to Wellington's civil servant, don't you? This is their job. In Wellington, they're meant to work it out. They're meant to have sufficient judges, court hearings, justice ensured. We don't. What's the Minister of Courts doing?
Well, he says, I have full confidence in the Department of Correction, which, quite frankly, I don't know how he can say that with a straight face. But we got a judge in the last few days, I'm presuming in Dunedin, but somewhere in Otago, who, when they were sentencing somebody for using a power of attorney to steal money and gamble some of it away, and the rest of it has gone completely missing, he sentenced them, and then he said, as for the rest of the money, because it was, tens of thousands, 80,000 or something missing, might have been more, and he said that they had to pay back $1,500 or some puny little amount. And then he said, you can use the civil courts to get the rest of it back.
Yes, I saw that. I saw that.
Really?
Yeah.
How on earth?
I saw that.
How can you do that?
Sorry, just to explain to listeners. I think it was a woman who had defrauded an infirm relative of something like $250,000. She had the power of attorney.
Non-relative.
She was a non-relative, that's right. But she had a power of attorney, and she was able to defraud the person that she was meant to be looking after of $250,000 or thereby. She was guilty, and guilty as sin, and the family was very upset and blah, 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 as you would if this was your father or your grandfather in that particular position. You're right. The judge said you're guilty, and then ordered restitution of, as you say, a piddly amount of money, and then said, if you want to go and get the rest of the money, go into the civil court system and sue that woman for the outstanding amount of money that is missing. When obviously the criminal thing to do would have, well, the right thing to do for a criminal court judge would have been to order the restitution of that, if necessary. And then, so they'll be in the courts getting a lawyer at what, $300 an hour. Take them 3 years to get it through the courts, and she'll probably declare bankruptcy at the last possible moment. What a stupid solution that is.
Yeah, it just so even if the courts were working, the judges seem to be coming up with some unusual responses to cases they have in front of them.
Now, finally, this. It's election in, a little over 3 months, 3.5 months' time. Candidates are being selected all throughout New Zealand for seats. You've been a member of Parliament yourself and a very successful elected member as well on local government level too. How old do you have to be, do you think? Or what life experience do you need to be a member of Parliament, realistically?
Realistically, I'd be saying 30. But, I mean, it could be late 20s if you had been brought up in the right sort of atmosphere, so you'd been watching it happening or whatever, or involved.
So your basic theory is that you've got to have some life experience before you can represent the people who are going to rely upon you, particularly at constituency level, or even as a list MP?
Yeah, I think so. And I'd say it could be a bit younger if you'd had other life experience, but in some respects, and look, people choose who they choose. That's what democracy throws up, all sorts of people. Now, what I think is interesting is to look at this movement to have like 16-year-olds voting and other people doing it.
And that's where I was heading. Yep.
Yeah, because you've got people who are being argued, and Stephen's case is on the front page of the paper saying that these kids who are stealing cars and ram raiding.
Sorry, I'll just explain to our listeners. Hilary, Anne Stevens is a King's Counsel, KC. They used to be known as a QC. Yeah. She's a female KC, a leading one, based in Dunedin, but with a national pedigree and profile. Yep. So carry on.
Yeah. And she's saying that these kids are bored, and you don't want to turn them into
hardened criminals.
Say they're really naughty,
yeah,
whatever.
Right. Yeah.
And that's got something to be said for it. But if you're going to say that you're not really responsible for your actions, then you certainly wouldn't want people who are still below the age of responsibility in the court system to be able to be even voting.
No, that's
or who's
right.
going to run their country.
Yeah.
These are people who can't be expected to be able to run their own lives.
Yeah.
And the other thing about
can I say though? Can I just add? Anne Stevens KC is a youth court lawyer. She does a lot of law case, and she's a prominent legal identity. You don't get to be a KC without being one, and respected by your profession and by your peers. The thing that struck me about what lawyer Anne Stevens has said, and it's the lead story down here in Otago, but I see it's New Zealand Herald's picked it up now too, is essentially her argument is, well, it wasn't an argument, it's an observation really, that there's no helping these kids, that the reason that they commit these crimes, and she was thinking about ram raids and petty thefts and stealing cars and, go joyriding at 3 o'clock in the morning, is because they're poor. That was her basic argument, that poverty, quote, typically drove crime.
Yes.
Do you accept that? Because... No, nor do I. I thought the thesis was odd.
Yeah, I think it's sort of weird to... Especially with... unemployment used to be the argument, and now we've supposedly got full employment.
Yeah.
And it's no longer an argument, and we've got worse problems than we had before.
Yeah.
And certainly, if you have kids wandering around with nothing to do and no supervision and other things, and who've been brought up without resources inside their heads and things. I think that's partly what's going on, because in a usual family that doesn't have those sorts of problems, they do what their parents do, and that might be go and play sport or go and do activities that their parents do, and they learn how to do it. You watch them on the side of the sports fields, and you watch like 8-year-old kids and 9-year-old kids, and you hear them learning how to yell out, "Good one," to somebody who's just scored a goal or something. You watch them learning to be grown-ups. And so we've got people who aren't learning to be grown-ups. You know, they haven't got somebody older who's teaching them to be grown-ups, and they've certainly got somebody looking after them who's older, whether it's the state or whoever else it is.
And that's the point, isn't it? And I think you make it well. I mean, here's one of our leading lawyers in the youth court arguing, a preeminent legal representative, that it's poverty driving youth offending. When, as you're pointing out, no, it's not poverty driving it. It is that these kids don't have a functional family or whānau life from which to learn the values, not only of our society, but also of behaviour. She actually went on to say this, and I'll quote it in this article. Poverty typically drove crime. The children involved needed role models and for people to talk to them. Well, isn't that the job of their parents? And then, which you would have thought, you know, is the obvious thing. And then she went on to say this. There's nothing to do during the day if you've got no money. It sucks. So you are going to look staunch, and if there's a ram raid going down there and your bros are doing it, you're going to join in because it's probably the only excitement you're going to get in a month. And who cares if you die? What have you got to lose? And I'm listening to that going, is that what he thinks is going on here? This whole concept that because I don't have anything to do, I've got no money during the day, I'm immediately going to turn to ram raiding because it looks quite exciting. My kid doesn't have any money. He's 14. He isn't heading out to get into a car and go and ram raid some chemist at 3 o'clock in the morning.
Yeah, and school, I mean, it makes you look at that and think, if that's your example, Anne Stevens, of role model behaviour, I'm hoping that there's not a whole lot of kids following your suggestions. Really? Is that the way she thinks
no, that's right.
Parenting works?
Yeah.
But I watch quite a few nature programs and things, and it's much more interesting than real people often. But most animals, it's very similar.
Yes, actually
most animals
You're right.
have a time that they spend with the older animals, the ones who gave them birth or whatever, for the time it takes to give them the skills they need to be a grown-up animal themselves.
Yes.
And sometimes it's, 3 weeks as a bird to be brought food, and then you have to learn to go and fetch your own or whatever.
Yep.
And sometimes it's years. But the whole premise of the animal kingdom is that there's parents bringing up the next generation to be functional next generation.
Mm.
Are we so stupid that we can't do what the whole animal kingdom, some of whom aren't terribly bright, can do?
It's a fair point you raise. Hilary, thank you for joining us again. It's always a pleasure to be in your company. I wish you well over the week. What are you looking forward to politically happening this week, if anything?
I think it's going to be interesting. It looks like Hipkins maybe knows something about Kiri Allen that the rest of us don't or something. It seems a silly thing for him to try and shut it down and send Kiri home on what she says isn't mental health leave or whatever it is, or whether he's sent her, she's sent her. He's taking his chances that he goes overseas and that nothing blows up. So I'm interested to see what's going on behind there.
Okay. All right, you keep an eye on that and use the Official Information Act to find out more about Tory Whanau. That would be very useful as well. Good on you. Thank you very much. That is Hilary Calvert, former ACT MP, former regional councillor, former city councillor, lawyer, businesswoman, and columnist and commentator on her take on what's been happening this week.